Welcome to the Rising Up Post Show on FoxLA.com. We launched last night with a look at the start to 2020, the loss of Kobe Bryant, the early days of the coronavirus pandemic, and then the death of George Floyd. Well, tonight in part two, the first protest as we mark the one-year anniversary. I'm joined by a panel tonight who were there on the streets. Recently retired Sergeant Brian Hill. And Sergeant, 31 years with the LA County Sheriff's Department, is that right?
That's correct, ma'am.
All right, thanks for joining us. And also we have our Fox 11 reporters, Phil Schuman and Christina Gonzalez. I'll start with our reporters. Phil, how was it for you to relive all of that watching the docuseries?
Well, it was a strong reminder of what we all went through. It wasn't that long ago. All the memories are still very vivid. And it's interesting to hear people debate the merits, if you will, of looting, burning, and violence versus legitimate protests. I think people have strong points of view on that question.
Mm-hmm. And Christina, you had some moments that truly went viral around the nation. To sit there and actually look at this from like a viewer's point of view, how was that for you to digest it all?
You know, it's really interesting because obviously we're still out in the streets and I'm watching it, you know, on my screen here on my phone, and it makes it kind of surreal in a way because at that point around the country, I was getting emails from around the world. It was surprising in some ways and yet in others not. But looking at the coverage, what I'm also seeing and what is amazing to me is the courage of the people. Because when you're living it, when you're going through it, you're going through it. But when you see it from far away, those people who tried to stop the looters where Coco was, everywhere, I am always amazed at the courage of the people that we were able to showcase and to show the world. Because there was really Monette, the woman I was with, and that family. I mean, their courage is really what it's all about, what they stood up to. That is really touching.
All right, Sergeant Hill, I was told I had to talk to somebody who was there on the scene, on the job. You recently retired, but take us back. What was it like? And your team was there in that documentary, that SRT team. What was it like to be there at some of the toughest parts of the protests?
It was harrowing, ma'am. You know, those are my people. Those are the neighborhood not far from where I grew up. Going to that scene, worrying about loss of life, loss of people's property, growing up not far from that area, wondering if I had family members there, my friends, kids, or anyone else. So my main concern was just the loss of life and protecting people in the crowd. I understood why they were there. I sympathized with them, but as long as they were doing peaceful protest, I had no problem. The violence was the issue.
So let's show a shot of you in uniform from your days with the Sheriff's Department. My question for you is, what was it like to take bottles and to see fires? What was it like to see some of the worst of it, the worst of humanity there?
You know, we had trained and practiced for that, and I had been through the '92 riots. Mm-hmm. It was harrowing. You don't want to see destruction of your own neighborhood. You don't want to see anyone injured. So it was very difficult for me. I come with a different perspective. It just wasn't professional for me. It was also the caring portion, why I came on the job.
And you started with Downey PD, I should note, before the 30-plus years with the Sheriff's Department. Christina, let me talk to you about your assignment today. This is the one-year anniversary of the death of George Floyd. What did you cover today?
You know, we were actually out with the Black Lives Matter LA protests, which were very peaceful. We did not have the incidents that we had a year ago. I think a lot of that has to do with the results of the trial that we are all aware of. And I think at the same time, I think people are standing back and seeing some kind of progress in some ways, not enough in others. But it's time for the people I talked to today. It's interesting how many remember our coverage from back then, and we're still talking, oh, remember the lady from Van Nuys? And I know a lot of them are watching this right now. I think it's good to see that today has remained peaceful, mainly so that the message does not get lost, because that is always the fear. And that's a good thing to see today, especially for law enforcement as well. I don't think they ever wanted to be caught in a situation that became so dangerous and so sad in so many ways, especially and Neil talked about this after what we saw in '92, which was horrible, the loss of life back then versus now, which we didn't have that kind of loss of life, thank God, and hopefully we never will. So it's interesting. It's time to stand back and think about it a little bit more. But it was peaceful, but it was reflective.
And Phil, talk about your coverage most recently on this issue.
On the Black Lives Matter issue?
Or today's assignment. You're right there in front of the LAPD.
Right. We're in front of the LAPD headquarters in downtown Los Angeles, which has become one of the key protest sites. And today's story is more about the budget than the anniversary of George Floyd. Just coincides with budget season and what's called the people's budget. Black Lives Matter is proposing a budget that essentially defunds the police department. Only about 2% of the city's $11 billion annual budget that the city council just okayed, and compared to about 45% of the budget that the city is actually, Mayor Garcetti and the city council has actually approved. So it's that whole issue about defunding and eventually actually abolishing the police department, which is one of the key platforms, if you will, of the Black Lives Matter movement, particularly here in Los Angeles. Now, Mayor Garcetti, of course, is 100% opposed to that, but he says some of the same goals that the Black Lives Matter movement is focusing on, which is investing in the community, essentially, are things that he supports 100% and also says that he's funded in this budget.
Sergeant Hill, I got to get your response. You hear the words defund the police. You see signs that say abolish the police. And I know it means different things to different people. Reimagining policing means different things. What do you think, though, when you hear that kind of terminology in those words?
You know, defunding will always hurt the communities that need the police the most. It's going to delay response times. It's going to come back on training. That's one of the first things that always goes when we have any funding issues. So I think it's a horrible idea. I do really like the idea of investing more in the community. Like I said, I grew up in those communities, and to see after school programs or any programs that help our youth or help with jobs or anything of that nature is always a great idea. But as far as defunding the police department or LA County Sheriff's Department, I think it's horrible.
All right, and you told me you grew up in South LA. All right, stand by, everybody. It is now a little bit around 6:30. We want to welcome our TV viewers who are perhaps just joining us from Fox 11. They watched on TV. Tonight's episode of Rising Up, day 2 of our series, explored the first weekend of protests last May, mostly peaceful demonstrations that were marked by headline-grabbing scenes of looting and violence. Let's take a look.
I think it's really important that when we talk about violence that we not equate property damage to the theft of Black life. And it seemed that there was almost a deliberate attempt to shift the story from the theft of Black life to property damage.
If you're talking about legitimizing the burning down of business to somehow show some form of legalized protest, I reject that argument.
All right, I want to get back to the sergeant who can talk about a specific photo that we have. This is of you on the job. This is during the protest. This is the Fairfax district where we saw all of that. And you're there with another deputy, and we see these smiles on your face. Can you talk to me, Sergeant, about this photo? What does this say here?
You know, Deputy Rifkin and I've known his father. His father was one of my supervisors at Lennox, and I had the chance to supervise Deputy Rifkin on SRT team. The smile was we had just been in the Fairfax district for 4 hours plus, and we were happy that we lost no lives. As it was pointed out earlier, we lost no lives at that point in time. Yes, there was property damage, and that's part of the job, but we lost no lives. We were happy and jubilant for that fact. And Deputy Rifkin, as you see, he's an amputee, and I had recently been shot probably a couple of months ago, so we have a bit of a kinsmanship.
Wow, that truly is a special photo there. And to think that protests had just happened before that were on national news. I want to talk to you all because all three of you are veterans. You've been around for the LA riots of 1992. So Phil Shuman, start me out. Is there something that you can think of that has been changed that you've seen since 92?
Well, I'd like to think that the Rodney King incident would not happen in Los Angeles in 2021. Of course, anything's possible. There's been a huge evolution in the effort to build trust, particularly in the minority community, by law enforcement. That's changed. What hasn't changed, and let's keep this in perspective and keep this in mind, 92, the LAPD failed to respond to the beginning of the riots. That's well documented. Well documented. Last year, particularly in Santa Monica, more so in Los Angeles, and also partly with the Sheriff's Department, also failed to respond to the initial time frame when things started turning violent, partly because they didn't want to engage. They wanted to be respectful of the protesters' First Amendment rights. But there are at least two, perhaps three independent reports criticizing the LAPD for lack of planning and preparation. The Sheriff's Department rolled in with their SRTs. You keep using that special response team hours after the damage was done in Santa Monica, which to me was almost like beside the point. So we have, and this is what gives sort of credence or weight to the defund the police argument, because a lot of people make the point that what they're doing isn't working. It didn't prevent the violence, it didn't prevent the looting. 92 was a complete disaster, not as much last year. So again, we want to be supportive of our law enforcement, and when you talk to Black Lives Matter and you ask them, when there's a legitimate crime, God forbid a shooting, the poor boy that was shot on the freeway, you want to eliminate the police? Well, who exactly is it you're going to call when that happens? And you cannot get a straight answer. So a lot has changed in terms of relationships between communities of color and law enforcement, but in some respects, they stay the same. And could these riots and protests happen again? Should there be another George Floyd incident? Absolutely.
Well, Sergeant Hill, I know you were among the team there to respond to Santa Monica. We can show a photo of you there on the job that was in our documentary. As you talk about what you think has changed since 1992, being from LA.
You know, I think social media has some of the blame. Yes, we could always do better. I would love to see more African Americans on most of the police work. I would love to see more of us join. I'd like to see more of our faces out in the streets of South LA, Watts, Willowbrook, and Compton. That will have a little more of a calming effect, I think. But I really think social media has to do a lot with, you'll see an event and you'll get 10 seconds of an event, and you don't get to see what happened before or after. You don't see the whole event, and people rush to judgment, and that's when we get the looting and the stories. I think law enforcement has to get in front of those things right away and make statements and get all the video out there that we can.
Phil, I see you wanting to respond.
No, I mean, I appreciate what he's saying, and social media certainly is much different today than ever before, but that exact same argument is what Rodney King police officers' defense attorneys made, and what every police officer's attorney that has something caught on tape says, that the video doesn't show the whole incident. Okay, well, there's 9 minutes of George Floyd video. Let's say it was an hour and 9 minutes. You're going to say that 9 minutes wasn't enough because it doesn't show the whole incident. That's always a defense that law enforcement and their attorneys use, and I don't necessarily think it's legitimate. How much do you need to see?
Sergeant Hill?
Mr. Shuman, I completely agree with you on the fact that when there's good video out there, there's good video out there. And we don't have to argue the merits of what we saw in Minneapolis. It was horrible. It shouldn't have happened. It was unprofessional, and it was evil. But I do like the fact that most agencies have video cameras of their own, and it exonerates deputies and officers more times than most. So I do think that social media is still the problem. And I would like to get, like I said, let's be transparent. Let's get everything out there. I love the fact that we are wearing video cameras now, and all that information is out there for people to see.
Sergeant Hill, you recently retired from the Sheriff's Department. What would you say to deputies on the job right now? How hard is it to be a police officer right now?
I just say still be vigilant. You know your core values. Most agencies have them. Just keep in line with that. I would always tell my guys, hey, just remember, department policy, the law, and is it legal, moral, and ethical? Just as long as they stay in those parameters, they'll do the right thing, and we have good supervision, and we don't cut down on cars. When we start defunding and cutting back, that guys are taking shortcuts. They're working longer hours, and that's just not good. It's not good for the communities. South LA, Willowbrook, Watts, Compton, wherever. That's just not going to work.
All right, Christina Gonzalez, let's pose a question to you. We'll take you back to what we've learned from 1992, some things that you've seen when it comes to change.
Well, you know, and I do want to add, because one of the things we talked about in 1992 that I think we need to talk about now in terms of law enforcement, I think that we talked a lot about, for example, what would happen if we had officers who worked the beats that they lived, or at least that they worked the regular beats with the people they know. I do think that a lot of the problems surface up when you've got officers coming in from a community that is 50 miles away from the community that they cover and is completely different. You know, as long as that is part of the equation, especially in a city like LA, it doesn't serve either side well. And I use the word side reluctantly, because I don't like to think of it as one side versus the other side. That's the problem. That's the problem at the bottom of this whole thing. You know, in 1992, we talked about more beat cops, and it was done for a while, and then that all went away. You know, we talk about social media. Whether we like it or not, everybody has one of these in their hand. Okay, what makes it to social media or not, the issue is that we're all being recorded, and whatever actions are going to come out, they're going to come out eventually, even, you know, with the officers' own cameras. The one thing that I do think will help tremendously in terms of the movement is that what we have seen this time around is the joining of the white community in the marches. You did not see that in 92, 93. You would see some elements, the churches and so forth, but the massive number of people who came out from all over to march with Black Lives Matter, I think that was seen by politicians. And as much as I hate to say it, politicians look at voters and large numbers of voters of any color, but they particularly looked at those marches and this, and you know in the back of their minds, many were saying, uh-oh, that's not just people from South Central or wherever you wanted to say. This was a movement that is much larger. And if they don't pay attention to that, that is not going to then lend itself to changing anything. Now, granted, today we're sitting here with perhaps one could make the argument that the city attorney, you know, has gone the other way and forgotten about, you know, there's no middle way right now. And that nobody's going to prison and nobody's going to jail and nobody, whatever. You can argue that all day. But if we had more beat cops, number one, I think that would make a huge difference, because people are not likely to behave like fools when they know each other. And if they are, they're going to get caught a lot faster. That's my thought on that equation.
Yeah, I think in the prosecution part, you're talking about some of the policies of reform with the new DA. I'm going to pose one final question because I've got like a minute left with my panel. And Christina, I will note that LAPD started a brand new bureau based on community safety partnership, where those officers have to work 5 years in that bureau to actually know community. All right, so while I have you all here, quickly, give me in about 15, 20 seconds here how you'd like to see us move forward. And Phil Shuman, I'll start with you.
I'd like more people to accept the fact that 99.9% of law enforcement officers join the profession because they want to help people and put bad guys in jail. They don't go out there looking to hurt people. Some people might hear me say that and think it's naive, but that's what I and a lot of others believe. And it's an incredibly difficult job, and they do it well, and I think that they deserve our respect and trust.
Well, LASD Sergeant Brian Hill, go ahead, take it from here. Quick thought.
I'd like to see more community interaction with our officers, deputies, and just have more community outreach meetings. We need to have those youth athletic centers open again. Some of them have been closed, and we need to get our youth back in there. I just like to see much more interaction between a lot of groups, maybe even Black Lives Matter and the Sheriff's Department, and not just the upper echelon. We need to beat cops out there too.
Well, let me say thank you, Sergeant Brian Hill, for joining us, and do enjoy your retirement. 36 years on the job in law enforcement. Thank you for your time. Christina Gonzalez, a final thought.
You know, we can all get along. I really do believe that. To quote a long phrase, I'm hopeful. I see things are getting better. I think they will. We just have to be honest with ourselves and what the problems are and take the politics out of it and start looking at it as a human issue, not a political one.
All right, we thank our panel very much. And Christina, I just want to note that tomorrow night we're going to see a piece of your video. You can catch episode 3 of Rising Up on Fox 11 at 6 p.m. We're going to meet the woman at the center of video, which went worldwide, mistakenly detained in the middle of all the confusion. And we start the deep conversation into the future of policing. Then, of course, join us again right here, back to break down things. We're going to be talking to Laura King, daughter of Rodney King, and Dr. Georgia Leap, Executive Director of UCLA's Health and Social Justice Partnership. And every night this week, we'll have a panel I've got coming up also, a sheriff and an LAPD commander. So lots to talk about. I'm Christine Devine. We thank you so much for joining us.